Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for the introduction. And I'm so honored that there are so many people present from the course, from the colleagues from the Pacific and from Asia and course participants. And I would like to very briefly draw your attention to the No Violence Against Women data logo, which you see here in the corner. Let me see, this is the pointer. And that's the logo that expresses that we have to know violence against women data to be able to have no violence against women. And this powerful logo also reflects the silence and the stigma surrounding the topic. That's the one hand covering the mouth and the challenges to collect its data, but also the relief that knowing and using the data may bring. And that's the other hand, which is also like a peace dove. And today, as Jenny already said, I have the honor to talk about sexual violence against women in the Pacific and the patterns that we see for the different islands and between the cultural sub-regions. And also, as Jenny said, I lived in the Pacific and I've been closely involved in the majority of studies in the Pacific. And I've worked with colleagues in the region to make sure that the interpretation that I will be giving makes sense in the context. Let me start with this quote showing the reality of married life for some. Life with my first husband was never good. I can't remember a good time with him. Once he forced me to have sex with him in front of the children. He didn't care. And these are the words from a woman in Cook Islands describing her married life. But they could be the words from women everywhere, in the Pacific and beyond. Sexual violence in marriage is more common than most people realize. In survey research, intimate partner violence is generally measured by combining women's answers on questions about behaviors representing. So you measure violence by asking behavioral questions about especially, but not only, physical, sexual, and emotional violence. And in doing this, sexual violence is usually included as part of intimate partner violence. And marital rape is commonly not looked at as its own phenomenon. And this is a challenge, especially in survey research, where researchers try to standardize, to measure in comparable ways. In reality, the concept of marriage and rape in marriage is highly variable depending on the cultural context and over time. And this is especially so because of the widely held perception that sexual violence in marriage, in intimate relationships, is not really rape. In many places, it's not legally recognized. And in many cultures, it's still seen that a marriage license gives a permanent, irrevocable consent. Once entered into a marriage or an established sexual relationship means that all sexual interaction that occurs within that relationship is automatically consensual and cannot be seen as unlawful. With this background, the Pacific Violence Against Women surveys that the 11 surveys that we have give us a unique chance to explore marital rape from survey data. And the Pacific is one of the first regions in the world to have a high coverage of violence against women surveys, all conducted with the same methodology. And that's really a great opportunity to explore data. So we explored quantitative data from 11 Pacific Island countries that have conducted violence against women prevalence surveys from in the period that it stretches is 2000 until 2014. These surveys all use the same methodology as developed for the World Health Organization multi-country study on women's health and domestic violence against women. And the comparable way in which these studies were conducted and the way results are presented in the national reports provide that unique opportunity to examine patterns of sexual violence in marriage in this culturally diverse region. So from the 11 country reports, we extracted this data on the marital sexual violence, but also on other types of violence that women are experiencing by partners and others. And we will look also at a specific effect of marital sexual violence on negative health outcomes. The No Violence Against Women Data Asia Pacific Regional Snapshot, our famous map and balls here, is a good starting point to understand the pervasiveness as well as the large variations of intimate partner violence in the Pacific, this part. The balls correspond with prevalence rate, reflecting the proportions or percentages of women who experienced physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence. The outer circles show the proportions who have ever experienced it at least once in their lifetime, and the inner balls, the inner circles, correspond with the proportions who experienced this in the 12 months prior to the survey, known as current violence. The green ovals mark the Pacific cultural subregions. The 11 countries for which we have data are in Melanesia, Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, and in Micronesia, Kiribati, the Republic of Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia, Nauru and Palau. And in Polynesia, we have Cook Islands, Samoa, and Tonga. And at first glance, we see that the countries in the Pacific region show on average higher prevalence rates of physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence compared to Asia. The relative difference between current and lifetime prevalence, depicted by the inner and the outer circles, is an indication of how pervasive intimate partner violence is in a woman's life once she starts to experience it. For example, in Vanuatu, we see that 60% of women have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime, but still as much as 44% have experienced it in the 12 months prior to the survey. So most women in Vanuatu who have ever experienced intimate partner violence experience it again and again or continuously. So a very different picture we see here in, for example, the Cook Islands, where the balls are smaller, so lower prevalence rates, but there is also a relatively large difference between the inner and the outer balls, showing that women are not constantly living with violence and have many more opportunities either to find support or to interrupt or stop the violence or to leave the violence relationship. So while this regional snapshot can show us some of the dynamics of intimate partner violence, it does not tell us anything about sexual violence by partners in its own right, such as in the concept of marital rape. And that's what we are going to look at further down the road. So we now will start exploring patterns of violence in the Pacific only. The data in this and following graphs is displayed alphabetically by country name and grouped into the subregions, the 3 subregions. So we often hear, and we heard it in Jenny's introduction also, about the alarming levels of violence against women or gender-based violence in the Pacific, higher than almost anywhere else in the world. And this graph kind of confirms that. It shows lifetime prevalence rates of physical and/or sexual violence by a partner and/or a non-partner combined in all the Pacific countries for which we have this data. And it shows that it's above global average, which is 1 in 3 women experience physical and/or sexual violence. When we see the Pacific, 7 out of 10 countries actually having more than 2 out of 3 women experiencing physical and/or sexual violence. And the lowest prevalence rates which we record in Palau and in FSM in Micronesia is still higher than the 1 out of 3. It's 36%. And we see here the highest rates in Samoa and Tonga. So this overall generalized picture shows that women in all the Pacific subregions experience very high rates of physical and or sexual violence in their lifetime by anybody. And presenting data in this way, combining partner and non-partner violence, gives actually a false impression that women's experiences in these regions are rather similar. So I want to kind of unpack now what we have been seeing here and break it down in types of violence and types of perpetrators. And I would like you to follow me and look at it as in terms of patterns and not focus on the prevalence rates or the numbers that you see, but more the patterns that you will see. So in this graph that some of you have seen before, because we have been building it up over the year with more and more countries, we will explore physical and or sexual partner violence and add to it non-partner physical violence, non-partner sexual violence, and childhood sexual abuse for the 10 countries for which we have this. And for the levels of intimate partner violence, physical and or sexual combined, we see now more variation than what we noted in the previous picture. They are in the same order, and you can see, for example, strikingly that Samoa and Tonga are no longer ranking among the highest, which they did when we combined it with non-partner violence. And in the 3 Melanesian countries here, we see that at least 60% of women report intimate partner violence. In the Polynesian countries, it's less than 50%. And in Micronesia, we have the lowest levels of intimate partner violence in the region, as well as the highest in Kiribati. So I'll add the other types of violence and see if they correlate or not. So if we add physical violence by others, by people who are not partners, this strikingly follows a completely different partner. It's much, much lower, the red bars here in Melanesia, and it's very high in Polynesia, even higher than intimate partner violence. If we add sexual violence by others, this is relatively high in Melanesia, and it's very low in Polynesia. So you see violence by partners and by non-partners is not correlated. And that was absolutely not evident from those overall prevalence rates that we saw earlier. So the breakdown by type of violence now gives us an indication of rather distinct and consistent patterns for each of the subregions. Melanesian women experience extremely high prevalence rates of intimate partner violence and relatively high prevalence rates of physical and sexual violence by non-partners. And we hypothesize now that in Melanesia, this type of violence is more gendered. It's more caused by norms of male entitlement of women. In contrast, the women in the Polynesian countries are surprisingly more likely to have experienced physical violence by non-partners. And these are often parents, relatives, and teachers. And it's much higher than the partner violence. And this pattern we hardly see anywhere else in the world. I haven't seen it in any other study that I've seen. So it's important to understand that this is different, because only then you can have context-specific policy. And I believe this is the most important graph that shows how diverse the subregions are. But, and I'll add here childhood sexual abuse, which I won't discuss because of the limited time we have. But this graph doesn't yet look at marital rape, but it's a very important one. So let's go to the next one. We will now unpack that first blue graph, intimate partner violence, that contains physical and or sexual violence by a partner. So in the next graph, you will see those blue bars again, but broken down by physical and sexual. So to understand marital rape, we present here the lifetime prevalence rates of intimate partner violence again, broken down by experience of only sexual, the gray parts on top, only physical, the blue parts of the bars, and both types of violence, the orange parts. So women that experienced physical and sexual violence, both types of violence. So let's now focus on sexual violence, which are the orange and gray parts combined as proportion of the whole violent experience, the three colors together. So what do we see? We see that in the Melanesian countries and in Kiribati, most women who have experienced intimate partner violence, the whole bars, have also experienced sexual partner violence. So this is the orange and the gray bars. So a huge amount of the partner violence is sexual. And we also see that sexual violence mostly happens when women also experience physical violence. You see, the orange parts are very large. So they experience both physical and sexual. And only in Solomon Islands, we see a relatively large group of women who experience sexual violence alone. That's this bit. For Polynesian women, the component of sexual violence is a much smaller component of intimate partner violence. And it's their violence is mainly physical. And in Micronesian countries, we see, again, a mixture of patterns, with the Kiribati women standing out because their experience resembles much of what the Melanesian women experience. So I'll show you something interesting here, the oval that I'm bringing in. In Fiji, in the report, the findings are segregated for the two main ethnic groups that live in Fiji, the Itaukei and the Indo-Fijians. And without wanting to go very much into going into the Fiji data but on its own, I just want to show that if you do that, if you are able to break it down and look at, let's say, intersections with ethnic groups, for example, you can see that national data, this is the Fiji national data, it can hide very diverse experiences. And you see there's a huge difference between this group. And this is the combined national data for Fiji. So I want to now dig deeper, even further deeper into sexual violence and look only at the orange and the gray parts. And present that in the next graph. So this is the orange and the gray parts. The prevalence rates of women for women that have experienced sexual violence by intimate partners in the lifetime. So again, the blue bars here are corresponding with what you saw before, which was orange and gray. And I will add now to this graph the prevalence rates of sexual violence in the last 12 months. And from this graph, you can see what I think is very striking is especially in the countries where women experience a lot of violence in the lifetime, that's in Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Kiribati, there are also relatively more women who experience current sexual violence. So that suggests that in the countries where a lot of women experience violence, they also experience it continuously, and it goes on over many years. So take note here again for Fiji that there is a big difference between the two ethnic groups for which we have the data. Since the overall prevalence rates of sexual violence can hide differences in acts, we will dig now deeper still and explore the prevalence of the different acts of sexual violence that were asked about. And the acts that we were asked were forced sexual intercourse. This is the prevalence rates for forced sexual intercourse, for coerced sex, having sex while you didn't want it, but have it anyway, and being forced to perform degrading or humiliating sexual acts. And across Melanesia and Polynesia, the sexually violent acts, which is experienced by most women, is the forced sex. In countries where the prevalence of sexual violence was generally high, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Kiribati, also humiliating or degrading sexual acts were also relatively common, the gray bar. So all these patterns are every time consistent with our earlier hypothesis that in these countries here, Melanesian countries and Kiribati, sexual violence is generally perpetrated in a context of more gender inequality and harmful manifestations of masculine behavior. And it really gives the impression that sexual violence here has a different meaning than sexual violence in Polynesia and parts of Micronesia. In our current concepts of marital rape, we often refer to the concept of consent or lack thereof. But is consent actually possible when many women have little choice or options to refuse sex? And that you can see from this testimonial from Marshall Islands. My previous husband used to force me to have sex with him, even right after I gave birth to the babies. For all the 7 pregnancies I had, I couldn't do anything. I was just discharged from hospital and really weak, and I let him do what he wanted. I just cried and cried because I couldn't do anything. For 6 countries, we had data on women who were forced to have sex after experiencing physical violence by their partners. And in line with patterns seen earlier in the Melanesian countries, the region with the highest level of marital rape, approximately half of the women who have experienced physical partner violence said they were forced to have sex following physical violence. And in Polynesia, in Samoa, the only country that we have in this series, it's only 1 out of 10 physically abused women who stated that they were forced to have sex after having been physically abused. So once again, these findings are consistent with that hypothesis of a different nature of violence in the different subregions. The forced sex may be an extension of physical violent acts, especially when violence against women is a product of gender subordination, expressing norms of male entitlement and male dominance. So listen to this woman from Solomon Islands. But I don't know what's wrong with him, because if he came back, then he would just bash me. And after he hit me, then he would want to have sex with me. Imagine you are a human being. You had just been badly beaten, and you had just badly beaten a woman. Then you expect that after you did that, she would be happy. So I want to say a little bit about attitudes. In theory, measuring attitudes should give insights on the patriarchal norms that shape behavior, in this case, sexual partner violence. And since we explore this marital rape or sexual partner violence, I will briefly show some data on women agreeing that they should have sex with the husband if he does, even if she doesn't want to, and on women agreeing that a man is justified in beating his wife if she refuses to have sex with him. And I see this type of data very often quoted, but I want you to look at it more critical, and I want to show you this example. You see here the data on proportions of women agreeing with the statement that a wife is obliged to have sex with her husband even if she doesn't want to. It's available for 10 countries. We see in Polynesia here a high 59% of women in Tonga agree with the statement, while in the Cook Islands it's very low, it's only 14%. And this is remarkable because the patterns of violence were very similar in these 2 Polynesian countries, as we have seen. And in the Melanesian countries, less than 40% of women agree with this statement. And in Vanuatu, only 18%. So these findings do not seem to have a clear or straightforward correlation with the observed patterns of violence. So for the second statement, a man is justified to beat his wife if she refuses sex. I think the findings are even more like surprising or unexpected. Especially here, Melanesian women report to have a very low acceptability of wife beating for refusing sex. And they are in a context of very high sexual violence, as we have seen. So this is really at odds with women's day-to-day experiences with partner sexual violence. So the problem is that people often want to use attitudes as a proxy or a predictor of violence. But we can see it can be really problematic to do so. We found in Melanesia, where sexual violence in marriage is common, that actually very few women agree with the statement that a wife is obliged to have sex or that a man can beat his wife for refusing sex. So this seems very counterintuitive. And then in Polynesia, we saw two countries with the same patterns of sexual violence with widely different levels of tolerance around refusing sex. So this apparent inconsistency and issues with interpretation point toward the facts that it's challenging to know what you are measuring with this type of attitude questions in quantitative surveys. The findings may reflect normalization or justification of one's own reality or community norms or stigma, cultural meaning. It can be anything rather than attitudes. So the challenge, this challenges really the usefulness of this so-called attitude data from surveys, particularly in cross-cultural comparison. To truly understand attitudes, we need qualitative information and women's stories. I want to also quickly look at the impact of sexual violence in marriage on women's health, because it's often not mentioned or recognized as such. Another graph here, and in the surveys, women who experienced physical and or sexual partner violence were asked about injuries as a direct consequence of this violence. And among the women who suffered only sexual violence, injuries were rare, extremely rare, I would say. And among women who experienced only physical violence, we found a lot more, between 13 to 46% experienced injuries. But among the women who experienced both physical and sexual violence, it's a lot, relatively much more higher than you would expect. And here you see the gray bars between 39 and 72%. And this is evidence that women who experience both types of violence, physical and or sexual, by a partner, they are much more likely to experience more severe forms of violence, also more severe forms of physical violence, as shown by the injuries. So this is something to watch out for. And when we look at associations with mental health, we see something else. For mental health, we have the information only for 3 countries, but it's very interesting and consistent. To measure mental health, we use the SRQ score. It's a score based on 20 questions, and when the score is higher, it means more mental health issues. So here you will see the average scores, first for women who have not experienced any intimate partner violence in their life, and they have the lowest scores. Women with only sexual partner violence suffer more mental health impact, but also more than women who experienced physical partner violence. While women who experienced both physical and sexual partner violence have the worst mental health outcomes. So sexual violence seems particularly associated with a larger mental health impact, which may not be noted by practitioner if the violence remains hidden or ignored, the sexual violence. So we are reaching the end, and we have seen a lot of data, and I tried to give you some general stories about what the data are telling us and also what they are not telling us, as you can see with the attitude questions. Remember this graph at the beginning. This is the data that's often quoted to show that violence against women in the Pacific is alarming. And you must remember this. But really, in reality, from what we have seen in this analysis is that the overall prevalence rates from this first graph hide widely different underlying patterns. Patterns of violence are clustered in the sense that women's experiences within subregions are more similar than between subregions. With Melanesian women, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Fiji, especially the indigenous women in Fiji, they experience relatively high levels of sexual violence, both inside and outside marriage or partnership. They have high levels of gendered violence, which is rooted in gender inequality and man's entitlement over women and their bodies. Polynesian women, Samoa, Tonga, and Cook Islands, experience relatively low levels of sexual violence in a context of high levels of physical violence, both inside and outside marriage. And the physical violence in Polynesia seems to be, to a large extent, disciplinary in nature. In other words, it's meant to educate a woman about her place, about acceptable behavior. And this is the type of violence that both men and women can be perpetrators of. So it's not so much gendered as in the Melanesian. Women in Micronesian islands have a more diverse experience of violence and marital rape. And Kiribati represents a pattern that resembles that of Melanesia. I think also you can see that all these differences give hope that violence is not inevitable. We also saw that data on associations with health outcomes show that sexual violence is associated with mental health outcomes and amplifies the negative health outcomes associated with partner violence in general. And the data from Fiji shows us that it's important to look at disaggregations and intersections to understand local meaning and properly inform policies and interventions. Overall, this analysis shows that teasing out quantitative data on marital rape can make a real contribution to deeper understanding of what's happening in women's lives. The findings that we saw have implications for health services, especially. For example, if women with severe outcomes are screened for domestic violence, the experience of marital rape, which is mostly hidden, should be part of the screening. And this will be especially relevant in the subregions and countries with high levels of intimate partner violence and marital rape, Melanesia and Kiribati. The findings also call for more especially qualitative research into sexual violence and marital rape in the Pacific to highlight the severity and complexity of the issues. And finally, while the laws are now recognizing marital rape, it's essential to consider how well these laws are understood and implemented. So quantitative data are very powerful and meaningful and have effectively influenced policies and programs in this age of evidence-based policy developments. Counting makes visible. That's what we constantly hear. But while quantitative data can advance our understanding of the magnitude and patterns of violence against women, including sexual violence in marriage, it's still notoriously difficult to collect this sensitive information. And the data that we get still gives a limited picture. We have seen that the overall prevalence rates, the rates that we are usually see quoted everywhere, can hide an enormous diverse reality. And one of the stories that quantitative data can never tell us is women's lived experiences. And to truly understand this, we need to include mixed methods. We need to involve anthropologists. data isn't only quantitative data, it's also qualitative data. And if we use qualitative data hand in hand with quantitative survey data, we can gain a much broader understanding of the issues at stake. And it will be we will be much better able to develop evidence-based, culturally specific interventions. So this analysis, as Jenny said, is written up as a book chapter, and many people have contributed to this work, but I want to show the names of those who had a role in the book chapter, either by helping data compilation or commenting or editing or approving. And I want to especially thank the original research teams and all the women who told us their stories. So this is the cover of the book that contains this chapter and a link to the publisher. I thank you all for listening, and I hope we still have some time to discuss and have some questions. Thank you so much. Stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Henriette. That was, I think I speak for everyone here and possibly online, but a really wonderful analysis of the data, and it gives us a new level of understanding of all of the war prevalence work across the region. I just, in the interest of time, I can see Tim has put a few different questions into the chat box, so maybe Tim, would you like to unmute and just speak to those questions to Henriette directly?
Yes, thank you. It was really such an amazingly detailed examination, and so valuable to compare the situation in many different countries. So just quickly, I was thinking, do we have any breakdown on violence against female sex workers? And in some of the non-intimate partner violence, sexual violence could be towards sex workers in those sort of settings. Do we know anything about that? Secondly, from this wealth of information, what can we really draw as important lessons learned and conclusions about protective factors that maybe are working more, say, in Polynesian countries, that could perhaps be drawn out and thought about and then presented in appropriately cultural ways in other countries, if we can identify protective factors? And then just thirdly, a brief question that I believe PNG is a sort of regarded as a Melanesian country, and you have PNG data, so perhaps that could be added into the mix. Thank you very much.
Shall I reply this first, or do we collect more questions? I mean, let me just do it while people think of their other questions. Thank you, Tim. I mean, these are great questions. And you must know these are population-based surveys. We do not collect in the surveys what if the women are sex workers. So we don't have the data from these population-based surveys that cover all women. I think the studies on sex workers are usually done separately on groups of sex workers, so it cannot be drawn from this work. I don't know what you're trying to say, but yeah, it's just what's available from the reports that we subtracted. Then the second question, yeah, we have in several of the later surveys, we have done risk factor analysis. I mean, definitely it comes in the Fiji report, the Tonga report. There are some others. So this data is available from some of the reports. Some of the earlier reports may not have that, but I should look into that. I'm not sure. But yes, it is available, and it can be looked at for each of the different countries. I didn't look at it in this particular analysis of patterns. And Papua New Guinea is definitely, I think, part of the Melanesian ethnic group, but we have never done a national survey with this methodology in Papua New Guinea. We selected the countries based on comparable methodologies so that it's as comparable as can be. Papua New Guinea has DHS data, as do several of the Pacific Island countries. They have very recently published a few mixed surveys with new violence against women data. Kiribati has it. I think some Samoa and Tonga already published or coming up soon. Vanuatu has DHS data, not Vanuatu, Tuvalu. But these data are like always slightly different. So we try to compare, otherwise the patterns become not very, very visible. Yeah, that's the answer to your questions. And Joe asks about age desegregated. Yes, it is available. It is in the reports. It's probably not in all of the reports. If we would have had the micro data, we could have done all of that as well. And this particular paper is based on, let's say, secondary analysis of the data available in reports. The micro data does exist, and we have for years been trying to find funding to do this much bigger analysis. Maybe it's still going to happen in the future, and do it with the original data sets. This is what we couldn't do. Yeah, no more questions at the moment. Somebody still has questions? Internet pornography. That's an interesting question. I think we should ask somebody in the Pacific. I mean, I do think that it's very, very destructive, can be very destructive, but I have no idea about how much that has increased.
I can just jump in quickly. When I was there some, I don't know, 10 years ago, alcohol use was significantly associated with sexual assault, and just extreme alcohol use and people passing out in clubs and pubs, and then terrible things happening to them. You know, it was really a significant factor for increasing sexual violence.
Yeah, I agree that when we do risk factor analysis, that always comes up. It hugely increases the risk of violence. Yeah, it doesn't say it causes it, but it definitely hugely increases the risk.
And Henriette, sorry, we have two more questions from Kim in Vanuatu. Maybe Kim, do you want to speak? Unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, Kim, you want to ask, or I just read it?
Sorry, yeah, I typed it in. My children have stolen my headset and taken it to school, so I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Perhaps maybe, look, I'm familiar with the surveys and the methodology, but the way that you could show like some data for some countries and not for others, could you explain like what that process is so that people understand that it's how that comes about? Thanks.
Thank you, Kim. Good question. Well, all the countries have the same data in the microdata, but it depends on who writes the report and how it's presented. We have a model. Sorry, I'm suddenly jumping into my last slide. Am I still? So they all have the same data, and you can do the same analysis with every country. But some of the reports I was involved in the writing, and we follow a very template of tables and chapters. But there are others who wrote reports with the same data, but analyze things slightly differently. So some things do not, they are not reflected in the same way in the reports, and we used the reported data. And some things could not be found in the reports. That's all. There is nothing that cannot be done if the database structure should be very similar. But there is so much data, and sometimes because of time limitations or whatever, some analysis not being done or not included or differently included. Like in Nauru, they left out, they made a much shorter report. So Nauru is only in some of the graphs. It's really because of wasn't all analyzed and didn't show up in the report.
Thanks, Henriette. We just have 2 more questions, one from Gunilla and one from Sandra. So maybe, Gunilla, would you like to ask your questions first?
Okay, it's Marco. Thank you so much, Henriette. I'm sorry I was late, but it's super interesting to hear your presentation. I was just wondering, and I think I raised it before, psychological violence, and is that not included, or is that something that could be included later on, or how does that work? And sorry, maybe you said that in the beginning. That is one, and then also if one could see a trend or changes in violence, if there's like an increase or decrease or whatever. And I'm particularly curious because when I lived in Nauru, they never talked about it, didn't want to talk about it, and said that there was never an issue. So not that it wasn't an issue, but it was just really interesting when we work with the ministers, and therefore I was just wondering if there has been a changes in trends. Thank you.
Yeah, very good questions. Yes, we have in the data sets and in the reports psychological violence. The issue with psychological violence, it's not similar to the attitude things, but the way we measure it is not like truly cross-culturally comparable. We give a set of questions, which are the same questions to everybody, and then we kind of say this is psychological violence. But at the moment, worldwide, we don't have for quantitative surveys, we don't yet all agree on which questions are the best one, if we should use cutoff points and so on. But definitely it can be done, and we have that. But I focused really on what is mainly used as an indicator for intimate partner violence, which is sexual violence, and also sexual violence was the main topic of this presentation. But having said that, we find, for example, in Fiji and in Vanuatu, there's a lot of analysis on psychological violence in their reports, and that psychological violence has actually even more impact on mental health, impact on women. It's more associated with mental health results and so on. So it is very important, and often women also tell us that the psychological violence is actually more damaging to them than the beatings or the rapes. So it is important, but it wasn't the main topic of this presentation. But also, yeah, what you say, from legal perspective, it's often not considered. So, but maybe we should, it's a chicken and egg, we should give it more attention, and then it gets more attention from in the policies and so on. And can we see a trend? I hope when countries are doing more surveys, then you can analyze trends. You can't analyze trends from, cross-sectional surveys. That is surveys that are done in one point in time. We do have now, for very few countries, multiple surveys. So in future, we hope to be able to see trends. It's still a little bit early for that. This work has started only quite recently, with most countries only having done one survey.
Thank you, Henriette. And maybe we've just got one more question from Sandra, who's in quarantine. So I'm not sure what her connection's like, but Sandra, would you like to unmute?
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, Henriette, for the presentation. I just wanted to ask if any analysis was done in terms of other variables, but particularly lifetime violence. For example, looking at women who, against women's level of education or labor force participation, etc.
Thank you, Sandra. Good question. Yes, in the surveys, we have the questions on women's education, on their partner's education. We have questions on earning cash or earning kind or not earning anything. And we often do see correlations. With education, it's often, with a little bit education, it goes up and then it goes down. With more education, and we do see these patterns, but you know, we see intimate partner violence as driven by a whole complex of risk factors or determinants at many levels, not only individual. It's also the partners' levels, the partners' characteristics, it's the community, it's the whole society. And if you do a good risk factor analysis, you pull in all these things and then look at what remains independently a risk factor. And very often the determinants for the women disappear or become much less. I mean, partners' determinants are often more relevant than a woman's determinants. So if you only look at the woman, it's a very limited picture. So it's a bit tricky to do that. In risk factor analysis, you take a lot of factors together and look and model that in a logistic regression, and then find what remains. Like what Tim said, partners' alcohol use would be much more coming out.
Thank you, Henriette. And I just, before we move to closing, I just wanted to open the floor to Sandra Bernklau, who's come with us today, the Director of Young Women.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Thank you so much, Henriette, for that fantastic presentation. And thank you, Jenny, for opening it up to us partners. You know, every time we dig deeper into these prevalence surveys, we find more and more rich data. And I think it's really critical, given our limited resources, to continue to go in and mine this information and analyze it even further. It's absolutely critical to make sure our programming is on point. And I think there's so much more data in there. And I wanted to get your views, Henriette. How can we, you know, continue to access and analyze the existing prevalence surveys? As you know, they're extremely expensive, and I think some of them are moving on to being about 10 years old now. But we also know from recent surveys in Kiribati that, you know, the prevalence hasn't changed in 10 years. So we need to dig deeper into the factors, the risk factors, and understanding the diversity that women experience in terms of violence in order to help our programs, especially around prevention of violence. I'll leave it there, but I just wanted to thank you once again for that excellent analysis and really valuable work. Thank you so much.
Thank you also. Just, can I say something? When we started this work 20 years ago, nobody talked about violence. So now it's for many women much easier to talk about things that they couldn't talk about 20 years ago. So sometimes when you think there is not a change, it can also be because more women are talking now. So you really, really, really don't need to be focusing so much only on that prevalence figure. One of my messages is really you need to have more of that contextual information to be able to interpret it well. And like in Vietnam, we saw there was little change between two surveys 10 years apart, but when we looked at the age distribution, we saw that in the younger women, it had gone down, not in the older. So you really have to do that deeper digging. Yeah, and that's crucial.
Henriette, thank you so much. And thank you so much to everybody for really concentrating, participating. And it's a little bit of noise, so whoever's unmiked, unmuted, please mute. Annette Robertson, the Deputy Regional Director of Asia Pacific Regional Office, has had to step away, but you know, Henriette, Annette and I have both been in that job, and you've worked with both of us as you've worked with so many people across the Pacific. And it's an unusual way to end the seminar today, but it's a very special way to end because Henriette is retiring. And for all of us, when we look back on our lives, there are a number of things that we hope that we've done well. There are things that we hope that we've actually contributed.
And to be standing in your shoes, Henriette, must be a terrific place to be, because you have given your life to studies on violence against women. You have pioneered and carved out an area and a terrain. As you said, 20 years ago, this wasn't the common discourse. And you've done it with absolute certainty, and you have kept going and kept going and kept going. Your resilience, your tenacity, your intellect, your courage, your ability to communicate and advocate, and your research skills have just transformed this area that so many of us are working on. I look around in the conference room now at the young teams that we have, and I hope that they are able to look back in 20 or 30 years from now and feel a sense of pride, and that today you've been able to continue to spread new seeds amongst everybody so that people continue on this work. Not that retiring means you'll stop, but I do think it's a mark in time in your life and in the intellectual and academic life and programming life of violence against women. So I would really ask everyone if they could please unmute, put on your cameras, and actually end this seminar today by applauding a really fantastic person. And in the final words of Annette Robertson, she says she calls you the mother of violence against women's studies, and now her child has come of age and is an adolescent teenager. So thank you so much, Henriette, for everything that you've done for all of us. So really, everybody, thank you on behalf of UNFPA Pacific for coming. And thank you so much for all of you and for joining here. It's been a really, really tremendous time and a tremendous moment. And we appreciate it.